Institute of Communications in Mexico. So welcome back, Commissioner Camacho, Chairman Scott, and welcome, Narda. We're thrilled to have you join us this year. I thought we'd start, there's been a lot of discussion over the course of the conference about broadband and competition. So I thought we would start with that as a topic, and particularly maybe just an overview of where things stand in each of your countries from a competition perspective, both fixed and mobile. And maybe we'll start with you, Ian. So what is the state of that marketplace? Maybe tell us a little bit about what you all have done on high-speed wholesale access, and maybe a little bit about some recent spectrum transactions and the freeze on license transfers that has been put into place in Canada. So just a few topics to kick us off.
I was going to say a few, and Bryan, knowing me, has already cautioned me to keep my answers short. Let's try and do this quickly. On the fixed broadband side, in terms of the competitive frame, in terms of broadband rollout, I think it's going well. On the competition side, we'll use that famous phrase, it's complicated. The commission, prior to my term, introduced a regime, a wholesale regime, and to be not unkind, but we didn't get it right at the time in terms of how we thought broadband would evolve. It focused very much on Quebec and Ontario, where most of the population is, but it wasn't national. It didn't distinguish effectively between the network architectures of cable providers and incumbent telephone companies, and the industry just didn't evolve as we thought. So the rates that were set up for wholesale and the terms and conditions in terms of, for example, excluding fiber to the home as part of the resale arrangements didn't work out that well. That all said, we went through elaborate costing machinations during my entire term, and a failure or a reduction in competition. And broadband rates actually creeped up for the first time in the last couple of years, which was obviously, from a regulator's perspective, disappointing. There's a redo underway. The notices are out, the process is underway, and it's a thorny issue for the commission because it does go back to costing, but the competitive, the resale or wholesale arrangements need to be revitalized. So we'll leave it there because the deliberations in between, I'm not entirely comfortable talking about while I oversaw it. But there's a redo. Meanwhile, rates are roughly on par with the US. On the wireless side, we did complete a full review in terms of market power and introduced a limited or a focused MVNO arrangement that focuses on facilities-based carriers. And the terms and conditions for that were established, and the commission isn't going to rely on costing in a decision while I was still there. We told parties to work it out commercially, and failing that, there will be baseball-style arbitration overseen by the commission, and a few elements have already started in that regard. There was obviously the Rogers-Shaw transaction in the midst of all of this, which, for those of you who don't follow it in Canada, was a major issue because it eliminated one of the large regional competitors, a potential national competitor. Rogers took it over. The political response to that, to accepting the merger, the outcome of the merger, had two aspects. One, the government has extracted commitments from the merged parties to provide pretty generous rates for competitors. And two, they froze spectrum deals, to put it simply. And that seems like, on a whole range of things, that seems like an odd reaction. But I think you have to look at it through a political perspective and saying, in the face of a lot of public criticism of allowing a major transaction to go through, reducing the number of operators, they didn't want any more transactions. And then in the short term, so they thought it was a good time to review the wireless framework which really is just a pause, in my view. I'm not privy to the thinking at the department or the ministry. How do you do that? You put the freeze on everything rather than picking a particular subset of spectrum licenses. Sorry, is that short enough?
That was pretty good. Pretty good. Now, two things on the resale. One is you said, and I know you took a lot of heat for this at the time, on the wireless resale side, you have to be a facilities-based provider, right? Not just, Bryan Tramont Wireless shows up. And then on the wired side, is there any conditions to get resale there for the wired broadband?
No, not in the same way. The wholesale regime for fixed broadband has been in place for well over a decade. And it's actually worked fairly well. Obviously, anyone engaging in arbitrage, to the extent they're effective, they start hurting their own business.
Yeah.
On the wireless side, the big push was for simple resale, unlimited MVNOs. They wanted us to mandate it. And the commission's conclusion was that would be destructive of competition because the most effective competitors were the new facilities-based entrants. And they were the most vulnerable to having a whole bunch of new entrants with very few limitations. So the commission's view was what we needed to do was facilitate more effective competition from the facilities-based players. And yes, I got a little criticized for not allowing more competition.
Just a little. Narda, how do you think we're doing in the United States on mobile and fixed broadband competition?
How we're doing on competition. I think I would come at the question a little bit differently, which is how are we doing with regard to services and the prices that consumers are experiencing. And I think, as this audience knows well, there have been some legislative interventions to try to address some of the concerns about access and deployment. And so I think those efforts are targeted at making things more affordable for consumers who might have challenges in that area. With regard to sort of just the market in general, I believe, again, those legislative interventions, and I'm talking about BEAD and ACP on the deployment and accessibility side, we're there to address market failures in some ways, right? And so I think it's a recognition that the market hasn't always been, maybe the efficiency of the market has somehow, and in some cases, left some people behind and without equitable access.
Very good. Commissioner Camacho, maybe the same question. This audience is not as familiar, obviously, with the Mexican market on the fixed and the mobile side. And then maybe in particular on the mobile side, you had a few reforms on spectrum fees proposals, and then the efforts by the government through Red Compartida, if I said that correctly. And those efforts, if you can spell those out in particular, that'd be great for the audience to hear.
Yeah. As you may know, in Mexico, we had a reform of even in the Constitution and a new law in the year 2013. We came to that reform after a very dysfunctional period of the regulator. So the preponderant agents, as we call it, had participation of in the 70s or 80s in almost all the markets, in mobile and fixed. So this reform was passed to solve this problem. Basically, what this reform established was asymmetric regulation, and the fixed network has to be shared. The preponderant agent, as what's called the former state monopoly, already privatized. This quasi-monopoly had to give access to competitors according to cost models. So in this part, we have advanced a lot. Prices have been falling dramatically, and participation rates, at least in the fixed part, have been for this preponderant agent are now below 50%, and we have a lot of competition from former cable providers that they started offering these new services. So in the fix, at least as seen in the participation rates, in the fix, it seems a little bit more competitive, and we have started, for example, liberalizing in areas where there are a lot of, or there are several competitors in the fixed access market. So in the mobile internet access, the situation has been a little different. The participation rate of the preponderant agent is now around 66%. So even though participation rates are not equivalent to competition levels, I mean, there is no a one-to-one relationship, but and there are some measure of competition because, for example, one of the complaints of the competitors of this preponderant mobile network complain about the aggressiveness in competition. So some level of competition exists, of course. And then we have some problems, some specific problems. For example, now we have this problem with spectrum. Spectrum is very expensive. We have the problem that, for example, by making comparison with other countries, we are in sometimes close to twice the cost of spectrum than other countries. And we have from the institute, and this is a problem with Congress. Congress has these annual fees that they charge for spectrum, and then they have to change it. I mean, if the spectrum is going to fall in cost, it has to be changed by Congress. It's not ourselves. I don't know if I can go on, or you prefer to?
A little bit more, and then red compartida, if you will. Yeah.
Okay. One of the other things in the market, in the mobile market, is that the red compartida is the wholesale network. Wholesale mobile network is called. Basically, it's a network that was set up from the start in the reform, in the 2013 reform, to sell mobile services to MVNOs, basically. So this network had several advantages. For example, it was given the 700 megahertz band at almost for free, like 10% of the cost that should have been. So this network have some access to, for example, to the electric company infrastructure and all of that. And this network was supposed to cover around 92% of the country or the population, and offer wholesale services for MVNOs. So there has been some problems with the development. For example, during the pandemic, the growth of customers, so the users was very low, and then they have problems. They went into reorganization, like the equivalent of Chapter 11 here in the US. So they came back, and now they are growing very rapidly. So that's one of the strategies that the Mexican government thought of, for increasing competition. I mean, this network is supposed to bring competition to big cities, to populated areas, but also coverage to rural areas.
Very good. All right, thank you. I want to turn a little bit now to Narda for this one on satellites. So obviously this has been a booming time for the satellite industry around the world. What role do you see, and obviously that's both a pure satellite play, as also the rise of direct-to-device. The FCC has very cutting-edge rulemaking in place on this. What do you see as the role of satellite going forward, particularly vis-a-vis the larger broadband competition discussion that we were just having?
The role of satellite going forward vis-a-vis broadband, I believe, is an evolving question, right? We all know that the technology is moving really fast, and the satellite-based services today versus what it was even 5 years ago is head and shoulders above. It's head and shoulders above what it was before. So I believe it's an evolving question. Obviously, it could be an amazing solution for the most hard-to-reach areas. So we continue to look forward to sort of the evolution of the technology to get us to a place where some of the challenges with latency and candidly the price are addressed for consumers. What was the other part of your question?
Direct to device, if you want to touch on that. Direct to device.
Direct to device. So we have an open proceeding. I feel somewhat limited in being able
Sure.
to talk about it because of that, but so I will just leave it there.
Okay, you want to touch on maybe then the Space Bureau and the need for satellite
Great
licensing
topic.
reform?
I love
I'm sorry,
those
I've got to get somewhere on that.
So I believe the way the Chairwoman sees it and the way we've sort of framed the Space Bureau is that there's this exciting ecosystem around commercial space, and the FCC has a really defined, robust role, and we want to make sure that we position the agency and deploy resources in the best way to address our role and make sure that we execute on behalf of the American people and the stakeholders in the space. I think it's not a secret that in the past the agency's been criticized for moving a little bit slow and being a little bit sclerotic in the way it looks at these issues. And so we're really hoping that the new bureau and the amazing new staff we've brought on board, as well as sort of redeploying the resources, will all sort of supercharge our ability to be contributing members of the space ecosystem for the U.S. government.
Very good. Commissioner Camacho, how about the role of satellite in Mexico?
Yeah, we have we have 2 satellites in Mexico, and in general there is they are occupying the what's called the C-band, the extended C-band, 3.3 or 3.7 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we think that that band is more appropriate for 5G. So we are in that process, but the satellite is going to last a lot more, probably 5-7 years more. So we are trying to tackle this problem. But in general, we have problems like we have just passed the regulation, the rules on satellite communications. It's a new, there was a regulation very old from the 90s. We passed a new one, and we established several provisions for renewal or substitution of satellites, and we have working on that kind of thing.
But is consumer broadband from satellite a major player in the market?
It might start to be, because we have a lot of, traditionally the government has had some capacity to bring services to rural areas, mostly to schools or to places where people gather to access internet. But today we have these constellations that are starting to sell services, and there are probably a few hundreds or thousands of small operators, WISPs. These small operators resell services, mm-hmm. maybe sometimes from satellite or sometimes from communication, from links that they establish to near populations, near locations. So it's a very dynamic market, but it's kind of very decentralized. It's not. We don't have a good statistics about that, but it's a very. And sometimes are very, very small operations, very small people with probably 100 or 200 users.
Customers. Chairman Scott, you came from the satellite industry as one of your jobs before becoming chair. How do you think about satellite both during your tenure, and obviously Canada has vast portions of the country that are sparsely populated. So how does it play for you guys in connecting with broadband?
We do indeed. Thanks for the prompt from my former employer. A quick sort of factoid for people, because we always talk about Canada being very rural or remote, but if you think of the three principal northern territories, they comprise 2/3 of Canada's landmass, second largest country in the world. There's 137,000 people in that, so a small town. So you can guess that satellite technology has been and will continue to play a pretty significant role. So GEOs have in the past played a major role. Nunavut, one of those three territories, is entirely satellite dependent. That may change if there's an undersea fiber connecting Iqaluit. That's a possibility in the relatively near future, but it'll still be a major focus. Obviously, as is the case in the US, the regulator is looking forward to the continuing evolution of LEOs, because it is, if you will, the ultimate solution for the hardest to reach areas. Canada's nominal target is 50/10 in terms of speed. The current coverage of that is 91.7, I think, percent last time I looked. We should be able to get to, I'd say, 98 in Canada with just the current broadband initiatives going on. That last 2%, I think it's practical to think of them being reached anyway, other than satellite. It has and will continue to play a significant role.
Commissioner Camacho.
Can I make a complimentary remark to the FCC about the establishment of the Space Bureau and a focus on it? I certainly, from my personal experience at the Commission, found that we were not well enough connected to the evolution and the speed of change in the satellite sector, and probably like most in the industry, very much focused on terrestrial networks and traditional technologies. So kudos for the recognition, and I think it's happening in Canada. We don't have a Space Bureau, but there's an increasing recognition of the potential of the technologies.
I think I speak for Narda. If anyone would like to interrupt with nice things to say about the FCC, feel free to just jump on in. Commissioner Camacho, if we can switch to you next. There's obviously been a lot of debate about supply chain and security of Chinese equipment, the rise of Open RAN. How does Mexico think about those issues in terms of equipment security, national security?
Yeah, we don't have a specific law about or a specific provision about security in communications, in telecommunications. There are several provisions about security and about national security or privacy and data. But in the case, for example, of the telecommunications equipment, we don't have any prohibition or any, unlike the US, we don't have any provision directed to a specific manufacturer. So every manufacturer that passes the technical regulations or any product that passes technical regulation is okay with us. No, we don't have any problem with that. We respect the let's say technological neutrality. So we don't have as in the US.
Chairman Scott.
Well, I think as most of you would know, Canada, for a long time, carefully tested and monitored equipment. Well, will be specific Huawei equipment, but it was being deployed particularly by new entrants because it was less expensive equipment. The government did finally make a clear determination that it needs to come out of the network.
So Narda, we're trying to get out of the network. You want to give us the update on where we stand?
Yeah, the procedural posture, I believe, is that the first tranche of requests have come in. The first set of deadlines have passed. We are definitely hopeful that Congress will look to see the shortfalls in the amount of money they made available for RIP and replace and address that in the near future. The carriers have been great partners in identifying the sort of the delta between what exists and what the need is. But I'll add to that by saying, in addition to sort of equipment in the networks and getting unsafe equipment out, Chairwoman's very focused on cybersecurity in sort of lots of verticals in our work. We've recently introduced some initiatives for our E-rate USF program to make available some pilot programming to help schools and libraries identify challenges and get resources to beef up their cybersecurity. The flip side of the cybersecurity question obviously is privacy, and we've been very forward in making sure that we look to any privacy breaches and address them with the carriers and encourage consumers to take measures to protect their data. And I understand sort of what their relationship with their carriers are and how that may or may not expose their data. So we look at security in a holistic way, both on the equipment and carrier side and on the user side as well.
Great. Governments around the world are obviously pouring dollars into subsidized broadband deployment. All three of you have sat at tables and watched these types of programs over the years. What are the keys in your mind to successfully deploying that capital? And what are the mistakes that you have seen that have been made that people should not make again? And I'm going to start with you, Chairman Scott.
Wow. It is going well. It's slow, particularly when you think about things in the north, where you're dealing with permafrost, where you're dealing with transportation issues, 2 sea lifts to northern Canada a year, for example, to get equipment into the far north. Those make the deployment slow. The money committed to the actual, to solve, if you will, the access or availability issue, I think is working. There are issues about labor availability, how fast the equipment can be deployed, and so on. I think those are universal challenges post-COVID. But all in all, it's going well. I think the biggest challenge in Canada is that, unlike the US, I'm going to suck up to the US government today. I'm here, I'm a visitor, is we have not really dealt with the affordability issue. And my personal view is governments have a tendency to turn to the regulator and say, intensify competition and rates will be lower and everything will be fine. But that's not that's not sufficient, because it's affordable for whom, of course. And it is those who are most in need and the areas that are hardest to reach, and therefore the cost is most expensive, for example, again in the north, where there's a real challenge. And I think the government will need to act in Canada, as was done in the US, to commit a significant amount of money to a program to deal with affordability at groups, whether it's fixed income or, you're all familiar with the sort of target groups. But I think that's not been addressed yet, and I think it will need to be.
Commissioner Camacho, we'll go out. We'll switch the order up here. We'll go crazy.
Yeah. In Mexico, we don't have a universal service fund. We have the policy has been more in promoting coverage in rural areas, has been more oriented towards wireless access through the 700 megahertz band or the 600 megahertz band. Actually, the wholesale share network was thought in the sense was thought about was the strategy seemed to be that it was a very low cost way to bring services to rural areas, because we have in the southern part of Mexico there are at least 3 or 4 states that are very very irregular in the geography, the mountains and small towns in very far away places. So the idea was basically, or has been basically, that wireless investments carried on mostly by public subsidies through the wholesale network had some regulatory obligations, and they have some spectrum for free or almost for free, and they have some advantages in exchange of this coverage. And then there is another effort is the electric company. In Mexico, we have a national electric company that is the only company that has the monopoly in transmission and distribution. In generation, we have some competition, but this company had two companies inside it. That one of them gives services to areas where no other operators are present, and the other company gives provides wholesale services, basically access to infrastructure. So they are collaborating closely with the wholesale network, and they have improved, or they have advanced the coverage in areas, what is called social coverage. That is areas where there are few people, that affordability is basically, I mean, people cannot pay almost anything for services, so most services are almost free or free. So it's basically, and this way of doing things seems to be very effective, because the electric company has a lot of infrastructure that can reach these places. I mean, the electric grid finally reaches like 98% of the country.
All right, Narda, anything from your experience that, subsidy programs should not do?
I would say one of the things we're proudest at the FCC is our maps. And I think the maps have been a great foundation for the deployment of distribution of this like generational investment in broadband. And I wouldn't necessarily say that we made mistakes before, but we're able to be so much more targeted as a U.S. government with regard to deploying resources around broadband, that I would encourage folks to use that model to really understand where service exists, so that you can be really mindful and targeted with what we all know are limited resources.
How are your maps?
You're going to make me say it in public.
Well,
it's interesting, when I earlier, when I was still in the chair's role, and I met with the chairwoman at the FCC, our first comments were about how much we needed to improve our mapping, and congratulations again on the progress that's been made. Progress is being made in Canada, but we have not made as much progress as has the U.S., and it's a cooperative effort between the CRTC and industry, or I said Industry Canada, and it's coming along, but ours needs more work. It's a problem.
Commissioner Camacho, do you have maps? What's the status of Mexican mapping for broadband?
Yeah, mapping. Do you mean that having a list of the towns and places?
And knowing where broadband is and isn't.
Yeah. That's generally done. We have the data. That's generally done by the Secretary of Communications and Infrastructure, Transportation. So and they have this list of towns that require services, and these lists are fed to the wholesale network and to the other efforts that are and they have been working on this regularly for many years. So we have like a list of towns that have some priority, and then we go down to less populated towns and so on.
Gotcha. Narda, okay, so what are the consumer pain points on a consumer protection that the FCC and the chairwoman are most focused on as we look ahead?
Robocalls.
Those bother people? I hadn't heard that at all. Yeah.
The scourge of our world, the robocalls.
There we go. A round of applause for that.
I will mention again privacy. And while it isn't purely a consumer issue, it is an important issue with regard to ACP and getting services, ACP money out to as many consumers as we can. So those are the three. I would say those are the three top issues. But I may remember more as we're talking, and I will jump in.
All right,
Since I know someone's keeping track.
Commissioner Camacho, what are the three most painful consumer issues for Mexican consumers when it comes to telecommunications that you're trying to deal with?
Yeah, actually, we don't have we share some responsibilities with respect to consumer issues. There is a consumer protection agency in Mexico, and we have been working closely with them. Basically, what we do is work with them. For example, there are some problems with the standards that certain telephones are not recognized by some networks. There are some technical issues that we coordinate with them to correct, and we have been working in the normalization of consumer services. For example, what happens when a consumer buys a telephone and they have a contract, a 6-month or 1-year contract, and what do they do when they cancel the contract? I mean, these kind of things. And we have also an area that works on basically on reducing information asymmetries for consumers and operators, basically informing consumers about the characteristics of the services, making the operators to publish clear information on all of that. Yeah.
Very good. Your big three?
The first two are easy. I'll agree, telemarketing, robocalls, something in Canada has worked closely with the U.S. on that. I used to get a report from our complaints division once a month on what were the 10, continuing items that people communicated to the commission about. That's the polite word, communicated. And I guarantee you that 4 or 5 of the top 10 every month were to do with fraud, telemarketing, robocalls. So that is like the unspoken one. Second one, wireless rates. It's a difficult country to cover, and I think the carriers have done a good job. Rates are coming down, but they're still significantly higher than those in the United States, and most other trading partners and Canadian consumers are well aware of it. So there's lots of work to be done. Those are the big two. The third one, I think, was just intensifying competition for broadband. And that's a trade-off. It's this seesaw with getting deployment. So the problem for example, in the north and in more remote areas is which comes first. People want competitive choice, but we don't have reliable service everywhere. So that's a bit of a dilemma, but I'd say that's the third one.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience after the. All right, well, I'm going to turn it over to Scott since he's the man that runs the show. I won't even do my next one. Oh, we need a microphone for Scott. Oh, it's incoming.
Sorry, I didn't mean to take it away from somebody else. So I want to ask about rip and replace. And this isn't really a fair question to ask of the FCC because it didn't come from the FCC, but you've presumably have seen the arguments from the carriers and the documents and so on. All that prefacing saying I don't know what you can say. But why did we get the estimates on costs so wrong? I mean, but the amount that the carriers say that we need is like 5x of what we thought before. Is it because they're surprised that a supplier disappeared when that was the whole point of the law, to take some suppliers out of the equation? Like where did it go wrong? What happened? And again, not blaming the FCC, they had nothing to do with it. I'm just curious because you may have seen some of the information.
You're right, I can't and will not say anything about that. I think that it's, in general, I think it's really hard to predict things like that, right? We were in the middle of a lot of supply chain challenges. So I think some of the issues that have been identified and some of the things we've all read have a lot of validity. I'll just repeat that, we're all hopeful that despite sort of where we're at, that the forces that be, the wise people in Congress, address this so that everyone can have the resources they need to get the equipment out of their networks.
All right, I thought I saw another question, Shane.
And the blonde lady at the back. Oh, there.
I know we kind of started on this on yesterday's panel, but World Radio Conference, I'm curious to hear what you guys think are your top 1 or 2 priorities for work. And I'm still confused. Is Ana Gomez going as our ambassador? Or as she's been up, or how are we? I know Jennifer mentioned this sort of slightly yesterday, but I'm kind of curious, who is representing the United States when we go?
Well, okay, so categories of questions that Narda can't answer for 100. But would you maybe we can talk about the World Radio Conference priorities. That's not you guys, that's ISID, right? Yeah. Commissioner Camacho, do you have any insight on that?
No, not really. I mean, I'm not into that really.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to talk about the World Radio Conference priorities?
Sure, I'll just say a couple of things. I think we want to focus on harmonization to the extent it makes sense regionally, which we've done at CTEL and all the other preparatory meetings going into the WRC. We want to make sure that U.S. positions on security and harmonization again are sort of brought forward and make it into the ultimate plank of adoptions that the WRC will adopt. And we're hopeful that the U.S. We know that the U.S. representation will be robust, as it always is, no matter who sits at the top of the delegation.
Do you want to talk, and we'll open it up to 1 or 2 more questions, but maybe I'll turn to Chairman Scott for a second. What are the areas where the 3 countries work together in this range of issues, where there is a consistent consultation / coordination?
I think we touched on a couple. Spectrum coordination is obviously critical. We have a very long, significant borders and border areas with population concentrated along them. So, that's I think, most obvious one. Certainly during my term, we enhanced the level of cooperation on telemarketing and robocalls, and I expect that will continue. In fact, I'm hopeful that work on call traceback will continue to evolve between the countries, because it's one thing to find out how it's coming into your country. It would be nice to continue following that path to points of originating points. I think those are the main ones. Obviously there's a ongoing discussion about other areas, but we have different approach. For example, on broadcast regulation of platforms, Canada's position is somewhat different because of our Canadian content regime and cultural policy objectives. So it becomes quite different than the policy objectives of the FCC. So not as much dialogue in those areas.
Anything else?
Yeah. My impression is that most of the or a good part of the relationship has to do with the coordination of the border, the 700 megahertz band, now the 600 megahertz one, and some issues of interference at the border.
Yeah.
So, and there are some issues about harmonization and all that. We have communication with mostly with the US.
Yeah.
So, Brian, can I just go back? And I missed a very obvious one, cybersecurity. Which it's not just the FCC and CRTC, but across federal agencies, that is obviously a critical issue. Sorry.
All right, do we have another audience question? Yes. All right, let me get you a microphone. And thanks everyone for enduring the intermittent storms here as you've migrated underneath the umbrellas.
We've only missed fire.
Yeah.
We've had wind.
Thank you.
Nobody.
So, question for all of you, not sure how much you can answer it, but how much of your time do you spend thinking about space junk? And particularly Narda Jones, given the new space group.
Space Bureau.
Space Bureau, thank you.
Orbital debris for 100.
In my past life, I thought about it a lot. In Canada, that was a responsibility of ISET, of the industry department, so CRTC would not have a direct role on it, but obviously it's an increasing preoccupation given the emergence and prevalence of LEOs.
Yeah, I would stamp what Mr. Scott says here. Our new Space Bureau, in fact, our old International Bureau, I think had and has spent a good amount of time thinking about it for the same reasons that, as these constellations grow, that will be a bigger problem that we all have to face. And the FCC does have some authority there, as most of us know. So,
Yeah, basically, I mean, we have been monitoring the situation, thinking about it, but we haven't taken any action really about the issue. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to do one more exit question. So you guys are longtime public servants. Recently, we'll define that broadly, something cool you saw, it was a great technology, it was a great adoption program, it was a great new piece of content, it was a whiz-bang thing.
Wow. I'm going to take a totally different tack. In Canada, I think one of the really formidable challenges it's going to be, and very interesting process, is how we apply cultural regulation to the platforms. And that's very much processes that are now in front of the Commission, and I'll be watching with great interest. The legislation is passed. It's controversial in some respects, but the real challenge is in the mechanics and the nature of a brand new regulatory regime that is much broader and needs to be flexible and responding to a truly changed world, and I'm going to be fascinated to follow it.
I was trying to do a wrap-up softball, but if you'd like to go substantive, feel free, Narda, to jump on in.
I was going to say, I was thinking very deeply about your question, but now that he's gone substantive, I will too. I'll say the coolest thing the FCC's done most recently that's kind of got me really excited is our work on AI and looking at how we can use artificial intelligence to improve the network experience for consumers, especially around things like, looking at trends and patterns to eliminate robocalls, for example. So I think it's having come from the Hill and OSTP, where the AI discussions were so much more broader and so much, in a way, harder to apply to our world. Seeing a very practical application of AI in a way that can actually move the needle on some of the things that harm consumers is pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm not totally sure that I understood the question, but I came into the telecommunications sector in 2015. So I am very new in this sector, and one of the things that have impressed me about, all this development of platforms, for example, Google Maps, Uber, and now artificial intelligence. I think these things, I was pretty skeptical at the beginning. I was pretty skeptical that these things were going to work. I thought, Google Maps is going to be plagued by errors and is going to be unusable. So, and the sector has surprised me a lot. But by doing things that I thought were pretty much impossible.
Very good. With that, a round of applause for our excellent panel, and we will transition to our next one. Thank you, guys.
I feel for in terms of being in a sitting position. I had that for 2 years now. Yeah, that's in front of me. No, it's not. The ones that we can't.
But I'm happy to try. Oh, yeah. All right.